Welcome back. We begin now to move into what we might call the Middle Ages proper, from the early Middle Ages, what some people would call the beginning of the Middle Ages, to what we could consider more properly the Middle Ages, and we're going to be here for a while. And the Middle Ages extends over obviously a long period of time, and we want to talk about what we might call the Middle Ages, and also some of the major, of course, theologians of this period. And so let's begin. One of the big issues with respect to the Middle Ages, as I suppose of any historical era, is trying to get a handle on exactly when and what characterizes this particular period. Characterizations of the historical periods tend to betray the values and assessments of the historians who name them. This particular era has been called the Dark Ages. Some people think of the Dark Ages beginning from the fall of Rome all the way through to the period of the Renaissance, which we'll be considering later. The adjective dark implied that the light of learning had been nearly extinguished, with civilization left in peril. But this is a really bad characterization of the period. In fact, from about the year 500 AD to 1500 AD, which is the 1,000 years that often is characterized as are called the Middle Ages, probably only the 14th century was as dim as people might consider. That's the century in which the Black Death rolled through pretty extensively, and a number of other catastrophes happened. But as far as we're concerned with the history of Christian thought or historical theology, in fact, this was anything but continuously a period of dark ages. In actual fact, while some of those days were dark, many times in many places learning was alive and well, and particularly in the West, and particularly in the monasteries, was quite lively and extensive. Against the idea that learning was defunct in this period, we must note that a renaissance of sorts occurred, beginning with the rule of Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, in the mid-8th century and continuing through what has been called the Carolingian Empire. A significant revival of education took place in this period. We're going to talk about that and the individuals, the theologians that fostered that, and also a number of other highlights of intellectual thought that occurred during this period. A renewal of emphasis in learning on the and literacy among the clergy. So let's talk about this Carolingian Renaissance. As we said, this is fostered by Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, sometimes called the Father of Europe, Pater Europae in Latin, who was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800. And Charlemagne stood at the beginning of a cultural renaissance, a blossoming of the arts and intellectual life. By the time of Charlemagne's birth in 742, the pursuit of learning was almost forgotten throughout the length and breadth of the kingdom. Now again, we want to make sure you understand that this is not a characterization of the entire Middle Ages, or even this earlier part of the Middle Ages, because as the quote on the right says, again, things were good at times and places, and not so good at other times and places. And you can see this in a book written by Thomas Cahill, How the Irish Saved Civilization, and it's a very interesting book, a very readable book, which is simply an account of how the Irish monks in the monasteries kept alive Western learning and civilization, in fact, this author would say, just by copying manuscripts of Greek and Latin writers, pagan and Christian, and while main libraries were depleted during this time, the monastery libraries kept growing as they continued to find and copy manuscripts and exchange them between themselves. And contrary to what Thomas Cahill might say, it's not just the Irish. There are quite a number of other monasteries all the way from France and what's now modern Germany and even Italy, where this practice continued among some pretty learned monks and scholars. So even though this author says with the exception of a handful of monasteries that remained active, I would say that was probably more than that, there was little literary, theological literary production, even in terms of copying manuscripts. Again, I would have to say that's true of some periods, but not the entire period. But leading up to what we're calling the Carolingian Renaissance certainly was the case. There were a number of times and places when this would have been true, that literary and theological production had been in decline. That changed with Charlemagne. Charlemagne had 3 sons who initially divided his realm into 3 parts. It was a bad way to pass your kingdom on to other people. It just meant that you were breaking your kingdom up mostly. And he recognized that, so he actually crowned his only surviving son, Louis the Pious, emperor in the Palatine Chapel in Aachen in France. Partly due to lack of proper political center and family rivalry and external pressures, the Carolingian Empire proved politically unsuccessful. It didn't last very long as an empire. However, a genuine cultural rebirth, this is why we call it the Carolingian Renaissance, took place under the Carolingians, which was to have a lasting legacy in many areas. 2 documents issued in the name of Charlemagne are considered manifestos of his Renaissance and educational reform movement. The Epistola de Literis Colendis was directed to the monasteries of the Carolingian realms. You can see again, they recognized that the monasteries were the places where learning was continuing, where scholarship survived. He directed not only that they should devote themselves to the practice of the religious life and observance of monastic discipline, but should cultivate learning and educate the monks and even the secular clergy. Now that's an odd term, secular clergy. What they mean by that is the clergy that actually moved among the people that lived out in the secular world. So there were the monks that lived in the monasteries separated from the secular world, and then there was the clergy that lived among the secular world. Actually, we would call them pastors and people that dealt with everyday sorts of problems. Even they were directed to be taught and to increase their intellectual capacity. Second document was Admotio Generalis, which was directed to all ranks of the clergy, again to the secular ones alike, in order to correct what was erroneous, to cut away what was inadmissible, and to strengthen what was right. In other words, it was addressed to all of the clerics, both monks and scholars in the monasteries and the everyday pastors and parish priests, to increase their intellectual capacity. And again, it was encouraging them to observe the Sabbath, to denounce sins and abuses of all kinds. But one section of the decree specifically obliged the monks and priests to conduct themselves in a praiseworthy manner and to establish schools. So you can see that they recognize that one way to increase the moral standing of not just the clergy but everyone else was through education, through schools. So what Charlemagne accomplished was, by these efforts, was a more standard Latin. Latin was spoken, again, among the scholarly monks and supposedly among the clergy. But like all language, it sort of had different dialects and different ways of expressing itself throughout the Carolingian Empire, which would have been, again, France and most of Western Europe, really, at this time. but it wasn't very standardized. So they undertook a revision of the Latin Vulgate. We saw that that was produced originally by Jerome, and that tended to, again, standardize the Latin. That helped in terms of, and not just in terms of communication, but in terms of scholarship, because they're all using the same language. Even more importantly, they standardized the 7 liberal arts. This is before the universities got going and had established curriculum, but in order to be educated, you had to study these 7 arts: grammatica, rhetorica, dialectica, arithmetica, geometria, astronomia, and musica. And you can probably figure out what types of the liberal arts, even from those Latin titles, we're talking about here. There were the establishment of cathedral and monastic schools, which led to the schools of the religious orders, the Dominicans and Franciscans and the Augustinians later on. That eventually led to the establishment, a few centuries later, of the universities. So it's pretty clear that the Dark Ages weren't really as dark as people might have thought. The first and most important scholar of the Carolingian Renaissance was Alcuin. Alcuin of York, and this is the York in what's now England. So that's again, as far as the Carolingian Empire extended, all the way through what would be today England, not as far as Scotland, but further down, all the way through France and all the way through parts of what's modern day Germany. Important measures that Charlemagne took to support this overall program included recruiting men, men who were of well-established credentials and understood as scholars. Several came from Italy, again, Muslim, even Muslim Spain, with by far the most important, the Anglo-Saxon scholar, Alcuin. Alcuin of York ranks among the most influential scholars of the Middle Ages. His works ranged relatively a wide gamut, from theology to political thought, philosophy to mathematics. Most of these guys were, multidisciplined scholars, even pastoral and devotional works. He was born in Northumbria in England sometime about the 730s A.D., educated at the Cathedral School of York, and he had access to a rich library, again, of notable teachers, again, that had been faithfully copied and were kept in the monasteries that he had access to. He graduated, became a teacher and deacon in the church in 750s, and though he had lived his life as a monk, he was never ordained as a priest and never became a monk officially. He became a teacher, and that's what he was known as. During his time as a teacher, he built this fine library again, and as we said, he established one of the most important learning centers in Europe. Alcuin met Charlemagne in Parma, and Charlemagne invited Alcuin to his court, where he came in 782 or 86, leaving England for good. From the 780s, then he was active in the court of Charlemagne, was arguably the most famous Frankish ruler's most trusted and important advisor for a while. So not just in education, but a number of other areas as well. His ideas and texts concerning education were perhaps the greatest contributions to the Carolingian Renaissance. Although he was not an original thinker, he remains one of the most important figures because of his numerous religious writings, his commentaries that he did on Genesis, Psalms, a number of other books, and a new edition of the Bible. Of his work in education, as an educator and scholar, in general, it may be said he had the largest share in a movement for the revival of learning, which the distinguished age in which he lived, and made possible great intellectual renaissance of 3 centuries later. In other words, he laid the groundwork. So he wasn't one who was producing original writings. And sometimes that's why people say this was the Dark Ages, because they didn't produce original scholars, as we've already seen and we'll see again. But these were the guys that were the teachers, the ones that were took up the scholarship of a previous generation and kept it going. So again, he was a teacher rather than a thinker. He a gatherer and distributor rather than an originator of knowledge. And in this respect, It's plain now the bent of his genius corresponded perfectly to the imperative intellectual need of the age, which was to preserve the scholarship from a previous generation and to pass it on, which is exactly what they did. So they took what had been either lost or not really lost, because there it was in the monasteries, or something that had been sort of set aside during the time of the barbarian invasions at the end of the Roman Empire. It was preserved, and Alcuin was one of those that made sure that it was available then to scholars of his age and of ages to come. Second scholar of the Carolingian Renaissance we want to talk about is John Scotus Eriugena, and he's one of the individuals that's often left out of historical theology. Maybe you'll understand as we look at him a little bit more why that might be the case, but it's got a funny name, so Eriugena. His name just means, Eriugena just means born in Ireland, and Scotus means that he was Gaelic, not that he was from Scotland, but he's from that same ethnic heritage. And again, he's one of those Irish scholars that we've already mentioned. He is a part of the Carolingian Renaissance because he was the scholar in residence at the court of Charles the Bald, not necessarily your best name for a leader, who was the grandson of Charlemagne. So you can see that this desire to have scholars in the court of the emperor was something that ran in the Carolingian family. We don't know when he was born. He seems to have died sometime around 80, 70, or not too many years afterwards. So we don't really know that much about his life. Again, his name simply means John the Irish Gael, or something of that nature. He was, again, almost certainly Irish, since that's what his name said. And as we've said, about 845, he moved to France at the invitation of King Charles the Bald, taking up residence in the palace school. He was a successor, I don't think directly, of Alcuin of York as the head of the school. And again, he succeeded in that enterprise well enough that he stayed there for quite a long period of time. One of the few people of this particular era that knew Greek really well, and that was one of the benefits of having somebody like Eriugena. He took the complete works of Pseudo-Dionysius, which we had talked about in the previous lecture, and translated them and adopted some of the main themes of Pseudo-Dionysius, such as the unknowability of God and the roles of negative and positive theology, and the themes of procession and return, and that would have to do, again, we're going to see, with the relations of the members of the Trinity. He knew, as we said, Greek really well, though he lived in the Latin West, and so he drew a number of ideas from the Greek East, and this contributed maybe to some of his the ideas that some of his contemporaries and even those that came after him found a little odd, to put it mildly. Again, we've already said that he translated Dionysius. He also translated another author that we haven't talked about, Maximus the Confessor. His most important but difficult works were his masterpiece, the Paraphysion, which attempted a synthesis between the Latin and Greek fathers on issues of cosmology and soteriology. And I guess that would be the main thing to remember about Eriugena, is that because he knew Greek and because he read original Greek works and translated them, he was always trying to find a sort of synthesis, a middle way between Eastern and Western sort of thought. The Eastern side over the Byzantine side, and over on the West, the Roman side of things. God, to Eriugena, was understood as transcendent, infinite, and ultimately unknown and unknowable, which might sound very odd to us, but there is a particular theological aspect to this. He argued that this infinite God manifested himself in creation, bringing the world, Christ, and all of creation from timelessness into time. He applied negative theology of Pseudo-Dionysius to the point where he said God is unknowable to us. God is not a thing like his creation, so he is no thing, which, again, sounds odd to us. He didn't really mean it the way it comes across there, just expressing it that way. He did know that God was there, but he was saying that God is so transcendent to us and so unknowable to us that we don't really know. This is an application of what's called negative theology. Look at the comment on the right of the PowerPoint there. Negative theology asserts that God is essentially unknowable. He's too complex and abstract a being for human beings to understand. That's really the point. Not that we don't know him, not that we don't know that he's there. It's just really, even the things we know about him, we have to admit, we don't really know. Like he's eternal. We may think we understand what that means, but it's really something quite a bit more profound than we might think. In any case, back to the quote there, then words will always fall short of truly describing him. That's really the point. So negative, sometimes called apophatic theology, is the counterpart of positive or cataphatic theology, which deals with positive descriptions of God's nature. So we might not be familiar with those terms, but cataphatic theology is when we learn about his attributes and his names from the Bible. We're doing positive theology. These are the things we can know about him. But apophatic theology says that even those things that we think we know, we don't really understand because we're talking about God. So back to the point there, we cannot speak of God in any way that reason would be able to fully grasp. I guess the word there is the key word there is fully. We don't really fully. We know, but we don't fully know. And yet God has revealed himself in his creation. He's even identified with his creation. And here's where Eriugena had some strange ideas. So that even here, God can't be known, but because of all creation is made of things, and he is no thing, he's not a part of that creation, and yet we can still know him because he's a part of his creation in another sense. So, again, that's confusing. That's Eriugena. Some people thought that he was even pantheistic. God, everything and nothing, the beginning and end of all things, with the universe in its totality, including God in between. That's his definition of God. And again, if God is everything, that's kind of pantheistic. So God is no thing, and yet God is everything. Again, maybe not why he's not the most popular sort of theologian of the Middle Ages. There's another way of spelling his name there. You see Eriugena. So Eriugena and Eriugena, same guy. Eriugena's familiarity with dialectics and the ideas of his theological predecessors was reflected in his principal work, the Division Naturae, on the division of nature, an attempt to reconcile Neoplatonic doctrine of emanation with Christian tenet of creation. We've seen that before. This Neoplatonism has been a part of the dialogue ever since Justin Martyr and affected people like Augustine pretty strongly, as well as Ambrose and others. So it was just that Eriugena was trying to bring these things into the dialogue, into the theological discussion, both a little late, in fact, and also in the West, where some of these ideas were a little less prominent. This his magnum opus there, we've already said, is another title is just the Paraphysion. In this work, he attempted to explain the relations between God and the created world in a rational fashion. His ideas derived, again, largely from Neoplatonism, and men like Plotinus came close to, as we've said, pantheism, and even magic and mysticism, and in some respects, modern rationalism. So it's quite a complex piece of writing. In addition, he was engaged in several other controversies over the Filioque, which we've already been exposed to with Augustine. This is where in the Nicene Creed in the East, the statement is the Spirit proceeds from the Father. In the West, the Nicene Creed reads that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. That's that word filioque. And again, he was just trying to find a way that was sympathetic to both sides, but because he was in the West, that didn't really sit very well with a number of people. He was involved in a controversy over the Eucharist. And again, there were two sides here. One said Christ was actually present in the bread and wine. The other side said that there was a symbolic presence of Christ. And again, this particular controversy is going to continue through the Middle Ages and actually show up again during the time of the Reformation. But we'll wait to explain that when we get there. Again, Eriugena tried to take a middle position. So he applied Platonic ideas to say that the physical bread and wine were actually there, and yet there was a Platonic ideal that lay behind it, and so it was sort of really there, but really symbolic at the same time. Again, if you're confused by that, it's simply because it seems like Eriugena wanted to have it both ways, and if you're on one side or the other of the question, that's not very satisfying, and it's really difficult to see his middle way very clearly. Another controversy that he was engaged in was over the subject of predestination. And we'll see again, this is going to show up during the time of the Reformation later, but there are two sides. On one side said that only the elect were predestined to salvation. The other side, a monk named Gottschalk, said that all are predestined, the good and the wicked, the good to salvation, the wicked to damnation. Again, a controversy that's still engaged in today by theologians, evangelicals, and others. So once again, Eriugena tried to take a middle position, and he taught that because God transcends being and time, the notion of predestination, as we might see it, or looking down the corridors of time or something like that, really doesn't apply to God. And just like with his comments on the filioque, his comments on the Eucharist, his thoughts on predestination really satisfied no one. So, why do we talk about Eriugena? Well, the point here is that the interpretation of Eriugena's teaching, not an easy task. On the one hand, he cites Scripture and the other writings of the Greek and Latin fathers, and expresses himself in the language of Orthodox Christian thought. On the other hand, many passages, his work again has a pantheistic ring. This author concludes he's probably an Orthodox Christian trying to express himself in language theologically difficult at times, but can be seen why sometimes he was considered a pantheist in Christian guise. Again, one of the reasons why we look at him is because some of the controversies he was engaged in continue on. His students found him just as hard to understand as our little summary here probably has been hard to understand. There's actually a story, probably apocryphal, that his students, frustrated by his obscure lectures, actually rose up and stabbed him to death with their pens. That's an amusing story, tragic, I suppose, in one sense, and we're not really sure whether it happened or not, but it's too good to not pass on to you as one of the stories about Eriugena. His greatest influence was probably on the later mystics, who took his obscure style and deep philosophical language to promote their own mystical notions, and we'll have a lecture in the future about medieval mysticism. In a way, his works served to not only to provide later scholars with ideas and writings, both to oppose and denounce, as well as to answer. And as we've already said, in a couple of instances, the controversies that he engaged in actually show up later on as well. Summarizing then the Carolingian Renaissance. In the end, the Carolingian Renaissance faltered. Again, as we've seen, probably due more to political instability and economic certainties than anything else. Yet the institutions identified by Charlemagne as central to the task of theological education remained. The need for education, the need for scholarship, the need for reproducing the scholarly text from the past. And they were able to play a critical role in bringing about the theological renaissance of the 12th century that we're going to see happened under men like Aquinas and others. and actually had an influence later on, even during the time of the Reformation. Well, we will stop there and pick it up in the next lecture, The Middle Ages Moving On.